comforting myth case at Gov is that society can arrive at one clear, shared understanding of what is socially beneficial for them. But such narrative becomes a workable standard for public discussion that societies can prioritize. Problem, we ask how realistic the world is in a deep pluralistic societies where people have different radical values, interests, histories, and threshold for harm, and where even the meaning of importance of a truth is mediated through subjective interpretation. That's why it needs to be complex, because society's self-determination is valued deeply on the ground to allow themselves to prosper. That's why even if you have radical feminists, even if you have progressive feminists, it's important because they have their own self-determination to prosper, their own belief, and through this process of interdiscussion, you can create a workable standard on how they should really come up with their differences. So even if they do have different interpretation of truth, that value of social harmony is simply important because the mechanism on how we arrive on that is not pre-filtered for you. That's why you gain more control and gain more freedom within the discussion. You gain less resentment. First issue then, how does progression happens in this chamber of comparative? The biggest mistake in this debate clings on the assumption of government that the process of prioritization on how the motion operates doesn't necessitate a discussion. But we first interrogate the coherence of transition in their world. The response is that the standard will be applied broadly, but that answer is simply unexclusive because the broad interpretation of truth already exists in both sides of the debate. People can already attach their own meaning, values, and emotional weight to the same factual reality even under our own model. But the difference is that you have your own freedom to reinterpret this. You have your own sex. That's the reason why we have different pluralistic standard in our society. We come up in our own social standard with our differences through the process of debate. So more importantly, this is not comparative at all because they fail to prove any real shift in how society functions under the motion. The phenomenon they describe already happens in the status quo. So merely labeling socially beneficial narrative as prior doesn't explain what changes, why the change is unique to their side, and why it produces better outcomes than a world that still anchors discord to the objective truth. Because in both sides of the debate, you can agree that we have different quote-unquote standard, and you have different quote-unquote ideals. And if you put it to the broad mitigated responses from both CG and OG, least and you can realize that you will still reinterpret this quote-unquote broad values that you try to forward on what's beneficial for our society. So what's the change? Problem again, this is not a debate about blankly choosing X and Y because the debate is about prioritization, as CJ pointed out, because that have created a black and white comparative. OG said that you need emotional spark to create engagement. On comparative because it happens in both sides. O said that people will lie. On comparative because it also happens in both sides. And CG said that the society's truth interpretation creates a lot of confusion. Uncomparative because your broad quote-unquote principled standard of what's good for society is also confusing at the end of the day. That's why it's very unclear on what's the realistic structure tension of this debate. We say that the prioritization in itself creates bad inclination because the moment that society says objective truth can be displaced by a better narrative, every actor is incentivized to massage the reality in ways that serve their preferred outcome. Secondly, the process of prioritization in itself forces society to chunk in 80% of their effort to positively forward this narrative. But at the same time, comparatively forward why this is much more important than the objective truth that we have. So even if objective truth remains valued in affirmative, the value that it has is placed on convenient situation where it aligns with the quote-unquote socially beneficial narratives. That are forwarded by whom? That's a question that we keep on asking. It's going to be dominated by a lot of people, and the problem is those quote-unquote socially beneficial standards wouldn't go up to the benefits of other sex of group. That's why you get more infightings in their side. Problem, the reason why objective truth matters is that it forces people to justify claims against something external to themselves. But once that anchor is weakened, political actors, institutions, and even an ordinary citizen are rewarded for not being accurate, but for being persuasive about what they think is socially useful. That means discourse becomes structurally vulnerable to manipulation because people are no longer disciplined by the question of whether this is true, but liberated by the excuse of, this is better for the society anyway. But in no point of this debate do they prove why the people who will do this already creates a great standard why this is going to improve a lot of societies in the first place. This is not a ridiculous claim of a extreme situation where people will suddenly lie, but rather on the comparative how the discussion prospers. Because this is why Joseph's first line of attack is crucial. This already kills out the entire claim of Goff on their coherence, and this also boxes out all at large because this is the realistic standard of the comparative. Always says that governments will lie, but that claim is not exclusive to their side because bad faith actors exist in both worlds, and the mere prioritization doesn't magically remove the incentive to manipulate, conceal, or strategically frame information. What matters then is not whether this honesty can exist, but which model gives society a more realistic standard for checking it. Our comparative is stronger because we recognize that this debate is weighed not on fantasy assumption that people suddenly become virtuous, but on which side better constraints abuse when inter-conflict inevitably remain the same. Second part in this issue then, where do we get better disagreement? In our side, general comparative, the case from Joseph is actually beautiful because at large, we can see this agreement is at least disciplined by an external reference point. In their side, the disagreement happens in a very, very much perverse and random way. Parenthetically, you open the door to endless contestation over which version of benefit counts or whose suffering is worth suppressing and whose reality is much more disposable for them. That's why, even if you have broad standard, you cannot just simply say that a lot of people will interpret this good. That's why you need to have an objective reference point in which people can go on into and produce this better outcome for them. Then at least the discussion in our side, even in the worst case in which subjectivity of clashing objective truth also happens, at least the discussion is not as bad as you can have more scientific way to discuss on that or delve with this. And the reason why we have different sets of leaders in our societies to come up and get their own interpretation within this truth. The fact that you have a radical right-wing feminist and left-wing progressive feminist already proves why diversification is natural. That's why it's needed. That's why you have to have this objective standard. Second issue then, where society is better left off in the long run. We say that self-determination matters in our side because people remain free to engage with truth on their own terms, arrive at their own moral conclusion, and decide for themselves what the fact could mean for their lives and in their society. That is the world coming from opposition is dangerous because it freezes discourse around dominant preferences and make it harder for minority perspective and other dissenting experiences or newly emerging moral insight to challenge the official story that they have. So our case is better, not only because it protects the truth, but it preserves the freedom of people to evolve in how they understand the truth without having that pre-filtered evolution that shackles them through narrative utility. That is the social harmony that is far more realistic to happen, and freedom is valued within its process.